Shalom and good evening. I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz of Norfolk's Temple, Israel. It's an honor to introduce tonight's program. I would like to thank Sierra Lautman, staff professional at the UJFT, for extending the invitation to do so. Friends, please note that tonight's program is brought to us by the Konikoff Center for Learning at the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater, as a part of the Lee and Bernard Jaffe's Jewish Family Book Festival. Let's think for a moment about the Konikoff Center and the Jaffe Festival of Jewish Books. A word about the Konikoff Center for Learning. Let me help put it into a Jewish context. The rabbis have a short list of the principal values of our religious civilization. The basics of philanthropy, of peacemaking within our Jewish community, and of spirituality are all included. But they also list the following: Elu divarim she'adam ochel perotehem ba'olam hazeh, v'hakeren kayemet le'olam haba. Hashkamat beit hamidrash shacharit ve'arvit. These are deeds so important that they confer benefit both in the here and now and in the future to come. And one of those is attending the house of study punctually, morning and evening. Learning is a fundamental mode of Jewish piety. That is not a matter of intellectual snobbery. It's a testimonial to what has allowed Judaism to survive and to flourish throughout radically changing conditions and despite repeated setbacks in social and political realms. For us, one of the gates to the sacred is through study. For that reason, the Book Festival is one of the most authentically Jewish programs of all the many endeavors underwritten by our organized Jewish community. The festival is in the name of the Lee and Bernard Jaffe family. I have had the honor of serving as rabbi to Lee and Bernard, both of blessed memory. I remember a visit to Lee, then in her final illness and quite weak, but nonetheless, she was strong enough to discuss Jewish culture with me. Her own passion for lifelong learning was inspirational. Bernard was a larger than life figure, a true lover of life, a chafetz chaim, and we honor his memory too in this excellent program. Now, a proper book festival is not only a table heaped high with offerings, either published or accessible by electronic link. It's also the opportunity to hear from important authors. That brings us to tonight's special program. We have a wonderful Jewish resource in Amy Schwartz. She is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbis section. Moment really scored a coup when it brought Amy Schwartz on board. Her previous experience at the Washington Post, at Harper's, the New Republic, and the Wilson Quarterly had already established her as a journalist and editorialist of insight and fluency. Amy Schwartz has an outstanding facility to engage with Jewish scholars and public intellectuals, spanning the several denominations and the non-denominational groupings of our contemporary Jewish community. Tonight, Amy Schwartz will deliver a lecture on the topic of Can Robots Be Jewish? I should tell you, when I first saw the topic title, I had some fantasy moments of Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet and Lost in Space. I know that is pegging my generation. Except in my little brainscapade, it wasn't Robbie, it was Ruvain the robot. And he didn't say, "Danger, Will Robinson." What he said was, "Oy vey es mir, lo mer gehen avec." More seriously, as you will hear, Amy Schwartz engaged scores of rabbis representing numerous shades of opinion and stances on important questions of the day. She has given us, in almost Talmudic fashion, a cross-section of the machloket l'shem shamayim taking place in our day. Let me explain that expression. Machloket l'shem shamayim means an argument for the sake of heaven. The expression appears in the classic book of rabbinic ethics, Pirkei Avot. Intra-Jewish arguments in which each side aims for spiritual and religious authenticity do not produce consensus, but they do produce an overarching structure of Jewish engagement. As the noted Israeli author Yossi Klein Halevi has said in praise of this book, it is a celebration of the shared religious language that persists across denominations, of the spiritual power of machloket l'shem shamayim. Now, after the lecture, we will have several minutes for questions and answers. The way for you to post a question is to use the chat function that you'll see on the bottom of your screen and type it in there. Your microphones are muted, and we're going to ask you to keep them muted so that we're not overwhelmed with dogs barking and cats meowing and donkeys braying. I mean, who knows what's in the background. After the lecture also, I'll take the opportunity to share with you some information about upcoming programs at the Simon Family JCC and the UJFT. Right now, though, we're in for a treat. Enjoy Amy Schwartz's lecture, Can Robots Be Jewish?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for signing on. Thank you so much, Rabbi Panitz, for that very kind, too kind introduction. No one's ever called me an important Jewish resource before. I'm quite overwhelmed. I'm very happy to be here to talk about my book, the book I edited. It is in fact called Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. I'm not going to talk that much about the question in the title, although we can return to it in the question period. I want to talk about the book and about my adventures editing the column that it's drawn from, Moment Magazine's Ask the Rabbis. Moment is in Washington, D.C., which, of course, without getting too specific, I'll just say is a good perch from which to observe the importance of being able to accommodate a diverse array of opinions. So I'm often told that the Ask the Rabbis column is people's favorite part of the magazine, the section they turn to first when they get it. And the best way for me to explain why that is to give you an illustration of how it works. So has anyone ever asked you, suppose someone's asked you, can Jews get tattoos? Or, so, what do Jews think happens to you after you die? Or, for that matter, can robots be Jewish? If anyone asked you a question about Jewish belief, you probably answered in the best online fashion that our teenagers would use, well, it's complicated. And that would be because it probably is. Any conversation about what Jews believe about anything, pretty much, is likely to be pretty long. Now, let's turn it around. Say you have a question, and you decide instead of Googling it, you're going to put it to 10 different rabbis. You'll get answers. You'll get so many different answers that you'll probably end up with a whole lot of brand new questions. In other words, you'll come away with, as Rabbi Panitz indicated, you'll come away with a dose of a very important kind of specifically Jewish wisdom. So that's what we're trying to do with Ask the Rabbis. Every issue, we try to come up with an interesting question, something that will spark reflection by rabbis and readers alike, and then we put it to our spectrum of rabbis, usually 10 from 10 different denominations. Not everyone can name 10 Jewish denominations off the top of their heads. Our rabbis range all the way from humanist, Jewish renewal, Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, and on through modern Orthodox, regular Orthodox, Sephardic, and Chabad. Sometimes we go to the right of Chabad. It can be complicated to do that for reasons I'll come back to. We also frequently feature an independent rabbi who doesn't consider himself part of any denomination. This one happens to be a he, but there are, of course, others. So we ask these rabbis to answer the question in 200 words or less. They hate that. 200-word answers are not really most rabbis' default mode, but the results are invariably worth the struggle. So we have asked these rabbis all kinds of questions. We've asked them the questions I mentioned at the outset. For instance, can Jews get tattoos? And Do Jews believe in an afterlife? Just as a spoiler, not only do the rabbis not agree on whether there is an afterlife, which you'd kind of expect, they also do not agree at all on whether Jews think there is an afterlife. We've asked the rabbis to apply Jewish law or tradition to contemporary problems that are definitely not mentioned in the Torah or the Talmud. So, for instance, what does Jewish tradition think about organ donation or genetic editing? We've asked them if Jewish tradition offers any guidance for battling drug addiction or dealing with single parenthood or coming out as transgender. We've asked them, are Jews still expecting a Messiah? And we've asked questions that resonate with current events. For instance, is silence consent? Or are we commanded to vote? We always rerun, are we commanded to vote right before an election? Because it's a fun question. Of course, there's disagreement. No one denomination has all the answers, and the sum of Jewish insight on a question is always greater than its parts. The patterns of agreement and disagreement are also interesting. Sometimes, as you'd expect, the liberal rabbis are on one side, they disagree with the Chabad rabbis. Sometimes, the rabbis at the two ends of the spectrum agree with each other, but they disagree with the ones in the middle. Sometimes they all agree, but they give different reasons and cite different texts. So, at one end of this array, we have our humanist rabbis, who go out of their way in nearly every answer. I think it's a requirement of the genre to emphasize that they do not believe in God or any spiritual power. At the other end, we have Orthodox and Hasidic rabbis who won't spell out the name of God. They'll spell it G-D, so as to echo the practice in Hebrew of avoiding the pronouncement of the divine name. Anyone who grew up in a traditional community is familiar with this reflex. A lot of people who grow up Orthodox will not say God at all. They'll use the term Hashem, the name. So far, so good. But then we have renewal rabbis. You think of them as more towards the left end of the spectrum, but some of them resonate to the emotional and spiritual practices of Hasidism. And so some of the renewal rabbis have taken to spelling God G exclamation point D. This is very tough on the proofreaders. In fact, I count it as one of my early successes when I had just started editing this column that I was able to convince a really distraught moment proofreader that it was not necessary for God to always be spelled the same way throughout this feature. It was okay if the rabbis wanted to use G exclamation point D, which is not in any dictionary, but that was okay. So what are we doing here really? Are we playing some kind of rabbi gotcha? Of course not. Partly, we're trying to make accessible to a lay reader these rich debates that have raged throughout Jewish tradition and continue to rage today. But there's a deeper reason too, and it's actually kind of important, especially these days. And the rabbi actually alluded to it again in the introduction when he talked about machloket b'shem hashamayim. To explain, I first want to take you back to a familiar and beloved scene from Fiddler on the Roof. So picture this scene. Tevye is trying to mediate a dispute between a conservative villager and the young radical Perchik, who's just arrived in town, who's later to become his son-in-law, you remember. So the villager says something like, who cares what they think in Kiev? And Tevye says, you're right. And Perchik responds, what do you mean? How can you just ignore what everyone thinks except yourself? And Tevye says, you're right. A third villager jumps in and says, he's right and he's right. How can they both be right? And Tevye considers this, and then he says, you know, you're also right. So to me, it's all there in that one exchange. The Jewish love of argument and the fundamental Jewish ethic of tolerance for differing views. And these are the two values that animate this collection and really a very wide landscape that we're trying to capture. I don't have to tell you that this principle of tolerance for argument and appreciation for argument has been deeply unpopular of late, but it is also at the same time deeply, deeply Jewish. Just for one more joke, we've all heard the one about the shipwrecked Jewish sailor who's alone on a desert island for many years, and so he builds two synagogues, right? The one he prays in and the one he won't set foot in. But beyond the zest for disputation, and perhaps essential to it, is the spirit of generosity, the sense you can always learn something from somebody else's opinion. This principle, of course, predates Tevye by millennia. Argument in Judaism, again, this is something the rabbi said, is not just a positive value, but actually a mode of worship. Multiple opinions are a given. Traditional text study is done in pairs, in chevruta, the better to thrash out the questions as you go along. And dispute is always accompanied by respect. The Talmud, recounting a debate between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, reports that a heavenly voice ends the argument by saying, Ilu ve'ilu divrei Elohim chayim, these and these are the words of the living God. The heavenly voice then rules in Hillel's favor, but the reference to these and these is cited approvingly throughout the tradition, in one case with the added comment, this is a principle for all of Torah. Today, too, the principle of ilu ve'ilu, these and these, sets the stage for a drama that continues unchecked in the pages of Talmud and in study sessions on Zoom. And if toleration of another person's opinion seems increasingly challenging, it remains the ideal for which we strive. So let's talk about the book. Those are platitudes on some level. How do we work this in the book? The book is a selection of 30 of our favorite questions and answers over the 15 years we've been running the feature. That's only about a fifth of all the questions we've asked overall. It's designed to illustrate the most fruitful of these disagreements. So they're in 6 sections: science, sex, modern life, politics, values, and the nature of the universe. Each one has questions in it that range across the 15 years. So you can also see kind of a moving picture, not so much of Jewish law and discussion, but of the contexts in science and society that surround them, the things to which they're responding. So that all becomes part of the story. So the most dramatic and yet predictable pattern of disagreement that we see can be seen in the question I started with. Can Jews get tattoos? Or the way we actually phrased it was, are tattoos and body piercings taboo? The only other question that displays this perfect arc of disagreement is the very first question we asked back when the feature started, which was, should Jewish children sing Christmas carols? And it was a laboratory experiment, offered a perfect range from absolutely not, across a spectrum of, well, it depends, to sure, whatever. It's significant that these are not per se questions about Jewish law. They speak to custom, tradition, assimilation, and so they do in fact leave a lot of room for opinion, perhaps explaining the pattern. So let's look more closely at the tattoos question. I'll take you through it. On tattoos, the one thing all the rabbis agree on, from independent to Chabad, is no, having a tattoo will not bar you from being buried in a Jewish cemetery, no matter what your Hebrew school teacher told you. But that's pretty much the end of the agreement. So Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, who was the humanist rabbi in this particular edition, says tattoos should be, quote, entirely an individual matter. The renewal rabbi, Laura Duan Kaplan, says Torah clearly forbids tattooing and self-cutting as ways of mourning or memorializing. However, Torah also implies that piercings can be opportunities for good or bad. The Israelite men donated their earrings to build the golden calf, but the Israelite women donated theirs to build the Mishkan, the sanctuary. So not so much whether you tattoo as why you tattoo. The conservative rabbi, Julie Schoenfeld, wrote that to characterize the issue to young people as taboo misses a crucial opportunity to convey Jewish affirmations of the fundamental dignity of the human being. The conservative position on tattooing states that while we discourage this practice, no sanctions are imposed. For the conservative rabbi, it's all a sort of it's a learning opportunity. I should say these aren't complete answers; these are excerpts from the answers that I'm quoting from them. The Sephardic rabbi, who at the time was a gentleman named Joshua Maroof, takes the quote more literally and perhaps goes farther with it. He also doesn't talk about sanctions, but he explains why. He says, tattoos are indeed forbidden by the Torah. The human body is a wondrous manifestation of God's master design. Hijacking the body and transforming it into an artistic canvas or a vehicle for expression distorts those fundamental principles and leads us to believe we can cast aside the divine image and fashion ourselves after the image of our choice. The Chabad rabbi simply says, tattoos are not kosher. The laws are detailed in the Shulchan Aruch and in Rambam under idolatry. So that's your basic stark pattern. But you rarely see it like that. You see all kinds of disagreement. A very different but quite a telling pattern emerges when you look at a question that actually was one of my favorites. The question about addiction, which we asked in 2014. What does the Torah teach us about addiction? And one reason I was kind of proud of this question was because obviously the Torah says nothing directly about, at least, drug addiction. It's all about drawing parallels and seeing metaphors. But watch what the rabbis do with it. So Gershon Winkler, who's an independent rabbi, starts by drawing a lesson about addiction from the story of the golden calf. On Sinai, he says, "The one who spoke and the world came into being instructed us not to get so caught up in our subjective assumptions about God that we would carve out and worship an image reflecting those assumptions. Addiction," he says, "is the act of replacing a truth or a need or an innate desire with an artificial facsimile that eventually supersedes that truth. Once you're caught in this trap," he says, "you have to be melted down like the idol, like the golden calf, to escape from the addiction of self-regard. You have to be melted down and cast in a new form." The humanist rabbi, Peter Schweitzer, turns to Cain and Abel. So what this makes him think of is Genesis. In Genesis, he says, God has accepted Abel's offering but rejected the one from Cain. Yet God doesn't give up on Cain. He offers him some straight talk. He says, "Why are you angry? If you are to do what is good, shouldn't you hold your head high? And if you don't do what is good, sin is crouching at the door. It wants you, but you can rule over it." The rabbi adds to this, "Temptation is there, always ready to pounce, always ready to snare us so we say the wrong word, or waste time, or self-medicate with alcohol or drugs, or even junk food. But we can also be master over it, not because we resort to prayer or turn to a higher power to pull us through. That is not what God says to Cain, but because we can take charge of our own actions and acknowledge our own human nature." So that's the humanist, no higher power. The conservative rabbi, Rabbi Amy Schwartz, looks to Exodus, but not to the golden calf. She says, "The journey of the Israelites from Egypt, from their narrow place, is a depiction of the journey from addiction to recovery. It's backsliding, always struggling to start again." So we can relate to that too. Then here are some interesting pairings. The Jewish renewal rabbi, Goldie Milgram, talks about Shabbat as a rebuke to addiction to work, or to anything you can't step away from, basically. Shabbat is the answer. You've got to be able to step away from whatever it is in your life. The penalty for work addiction, or for working more than 6 days a week, she notes, ominously, was stoning. The modern Orthodox rabbi, Yitz Greenberg, a distinguished figure, he's seen in many contexts, he doesn't mention penalties, but he uses the exact same phrase about Shabbat as the renewal rabbi. It's there, among other things, to prevent work addiction. Then the Reform rabbi, Sari Laufer, takes as her starting point the story of Noah, who, people may remember, emerging from the ark after the flood and seeing the destruction of the entire world, immediately drinks himself into oblivion. So the other person who immediately goes to that story is the Chabad rabbi, Shais Taub, who starts by saying, "Noah was not out to have a good time. He was on a mission to blot out self-consciousness." Rabbi Taub, whom I reached out to for this answer because he had written a book about addiction in a Hasidic context, goes on to write movingly of, quote, "the pain of self-awareness on one hand and of self-obliteration on the other," and concludes that addiction is but the human condition writ large. We're only happy once we get over ourselves, and that is recovery from addiction, when I realize the only way I can truly function is through extreme selflessness and surrender to a power greater than myself. Note that he ends at a position exactly 180 degrees opposed to the humanist, who emphasizes that surrendering to a higher power is not what God wants from Cain. And yet, if I had to characterize these disagreements, I would say that these insights, though they use a range of vocabularies, they echo each other on substance. Even when you have the complete 180-degree switch, somehow they're both conveying different versions of the same sensibility of this cowering human being, plucking up his internal resources before the void. So those are two of many ways that the rabbis disagree, and yet disagree in a way that creates a larger whole. There are many other surprises of this kind. Sometimes it's on a lighter note. The robot's question, when we asked, can a robot be Jewish? It was the summer. We really wanted to know how people would address the question of sort of what makes us human? If you can get at what makes a person Jewish, and maybe what makes a person human, you might be able to get at something fundamental in a world where artificial intelligence is becoming more and more of a real thing. We thought maybe they could get at something significant there. The main thing I learned about rabbis from the answers to this question was that a very large number of rabbis, before they became rabbis, spent some kind of a lengthy apprenticeship as science fiction geeks, because they responded so fluently to this question. The most orthodox of the rabbis all Yitz Greenberg, the modern Orthodox rabbi, produced a dialogue. He's in discussion with his rabbi. They're arguing about whether the rabbi is Jewish. The rabbi keeps saying, of course I'm Jewish, I this, I that. The rabbi keeps saying, that doesn't make you Jewish. The rabbi says, if you're so Jewish, can I arrange to have you circumcised? The robot says, no, I'm already Jewish. The robot says, I played the Jewish robot in Star Wars. The rabbi says, there wasn't a Jewish robot in Star Wars. The robot says, sure there was. I worried all the time. And ultimately, so this goes on for a while. We were actually thinking of doing a PR thing where the rabbi actually went on TikTok or something and conversed with his robot. In the end, the robot says to him, aren't you embarrassed to be holding out on me? What is this? Shouldn't we all try to do whatever we can for Jewish continuity? And by the way, when you're in Israel with your grandchildren, you never call me, you never write to me. And the rabbi says, okay, you're Jewish. But obviously some of the rabbis go at this in a non-flippant way. One of the rabbis called me in perplexity and said, what in the world are you looking for here? I can't imagine any possible answer to this question that would be substantive. And so we talked a little bit about what makes someone Jewish, what would make what could there be Jewish about an inanimate object? What could there be Jewish about someone who's not human? And she finally said, well, what about my dog? I mean, I kind of feel like my dog is Jewish. No one in the household loves Shabbat like my dog. And so I said, write about that a little bit. And so she came up with this really quite beautiful little meditation about how there's some Talmud to the effect that to be Jewish, to have a Yiddish neshama, a person needs only to have been loved and cared for by Jews and to matter to them. And so she says, maybe a child's doll can be Jewish. Maybe my dog can be Jewish. What, we've always been a mixed multitude. There's plenty of blessing to go around. So anyway, this is a question like that. I hope you didn't think that there would be an hour-long scientific discussion on whether robots can be Jewish, but a question like that helps us to look at the nature of inquiries and the nature of questions. What kinds of how do we address these questions? Obviously, several rabbis came up with discussions of the golem. The golem, Prague and otherwise, is a man of clay, an artificial man who is brought to life by a rabbi, and then leaves again, ceases to be human again. And the golem is deeply enmeshed in all sorts of, also in science fiction, both currently and in starting with Mary Shelley and the Frankenstein monster. Some people think that she was inspired by the golem, but there's also an extensive discussion in Talmud. Came from the independent rabbi who's got some good text. Can a golem be counted in a minion? And interestingly enough, there are some opinions to the effect that a golem, under certain circumstances, can in fact be counted in a minion. It has to do with, does a golem follow a matrilineal line? No, if a golem is created by a tzaddik, then that golem is obviously patrilineal in descent. So that raises additional questions. One of our Orthodox rabbis said, I'm on a conversion council and I just can't see it. A robot doesn't have a Jewish mother, so that's one way to become Jewish, is to have a Jewish mother. And to have a Jewish soul and to convert, I don't know, he said, I just haven't seen it. The Beit Din hasn't seen it. So I'm inclined to say no. So there have been many other surprises of this kind. I don't feel like I need to go on indefinitely, but I will say that sometimes the rabbis surprisingly agree. We have a whole chapter where the rabbis are asked about sex. And part of the reason we did that was because it's really surprising how little disagreement there is among the rabbis, from liberal to conservative, on questions like, when does life begin? This question we asked, when does life begin, in 2009? And a lot of things have changed politically since 2009. And one thing that is frequently pointed to is that it used to be that Orthodox rabbis were very willing to say, when asked, that Jewish orthodoxy isn't like evangelical Christianity on the abortion question. That there aren't any lines of Jewish thought that say that uh, human life begins at conception. And that is, in fact, what all the rabbis said. This was a case where we even had, this is before I was the editor, so I don't know how we managed to do this, but we even had what was then called an ultra-Orthodox respondent from Aish HaTorah. Nowadays, they've asked us to stop using the term ultra-Orthodox. It's now considered mildly pejorative. The people prefer to be referred to as Haredim or traditionalist or something like that. But this particular rabbi said, yeah, according to Jewish law, before 40 days, the fetus is water, is only water. Is not has no intrinsic value, and that's different from conservative Christian views. And I was all set to think that, well, these days it would be harder, and you do sometimes see drift on this. But I just after a conversation with Rabbi Panitz this afternoon, I was looking at an article by Rabbi Avi Shafran, who's the public voice of Agudat Israel, and he came back to this question in a discussion of why Orthodox Jews voted for Trump, and he said, look, we don't agree with our evangelical Christian brethren on when life begins. It's not that. We still believe, Jewish law holds that the fetus is not human at the moment of conception. However, we have other things in common with their values and so forth and so on. So I was kind of struck by that. I thought, I had been worried that part of the book was out of date, that if you went back to this particular rabbi and said, do you still believe this exact thing? He might say no. But, I think the tradition holds what it holds, and people are good on that. I can think of one circumstance where a rabbi was disinclined to have his sect, or whatever you'd call it, his denomination, answer a question for us, and we had a question more recently. What does Jewish law say about contraception? I forget what the exact. Does Jewish tradition offer any guidance on contraception? And this was another case where, across the board, pretty much. I mean, we're not capturing the entire community, only the people who are willing to write for us and appear in a feature like this. So I can't say for sure that I'm capturing the entire spectrum of Jewish belief or practice, but all the denominations agreed that contraception, although there might be lifestyle disagreements over whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, was certainly not in contravention of any Jewish commandments, in even the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, which only covers up to 2 children for the man, and it doesn't apply to the woman. There's a lot of interesting stuff like that. But I did get a call back from the person who sometimes connects me with Chabad rabbis. I don't always use the same rabbis for these denominations. Some denominations have a person who will, if they don't want to answer it, they'll look around for a rabbi that they think would like to. And the Chabad rabbi who does this, whom I know well, I've worked with him happily for many years, said, we just feel like only a woman should answer this question. It should be a woman's voice. And I said, well, this is a feature we'd really only ask rabbis. This is a feature for rabbis. And he said, look, these women I'm talking about, they are absolutely just as good as rabbis. And I, I see that, I get that. But since they're not rabbis, that's your problem, not my problem. Basically, that they're not rabbis was my feeling, although I was more polite about it. And so I said, look, see what you can do. We can't have a non-rabbi, but if you, I don't see why you can't have a rabbi talk about this if it's what you believe. And so eventually, at the last minute, I got a call back. Look, we just don't feel we can answer this one. I hope you understand. And I did understand. And I think, as I say in the introduction, that I think the limits of ilu ve'ilu, these and these are the words of the living God. I think the limits of that are different for everybody. And I'm not going to stand up and say I have no limits on my own personal sense of ilu ve'ilu. I think the tradition has its views, and so do we all. But this is basically just to say that there are all kinds of forms of disagreement, all kinds of forms of disagreement that hides real agreement. and that there are sort of endless surprises. Perhaps the most surprising single answer that I got came from the question over whether the tradition had any guidance for people who are transgender or struggling with their gender. You would think that would be a difficult question. Turns out the answer is, yeah, tradition has lots and lots and lots to say about transgender people. The tradition, the rabbis of the Talmud, going back to the 2nd century CE, recognized up to 5 different genders, and they have names for them. And they look around. There's the Ilonit, who has this kind of genitalia, and then there's the Tumtum, who has that kind of genitalia. And this one can both inherit like a man and be taken care of by the estate like a daughter. And this one can do this, and this one can do that. And when you think about it, you would have to say, I come away from this with 2 different points in my head. One is a sort of a specific one to the subject, which is we should realize that in a say a medieval world where there were such things as eunuchs, people shouldn't be so astounded that there was a sophisticated view of gender. And then more generally, I just think these kinds of discussions are, as fresh as today, but they're also as old as human variation and human weakness. All these questions that the rabbis are dealing with, they're as old as what it means to be human. So let me just finish by saying that I've been editing this feature for a decade, and the rabbis' answers never fail to amaze, never fail to inspire me. You can read right through this book, or you can browse around in it and look things up in it like you would a sort of a more traditional Jewish text, and you'll learn just as much from the disagreements as from the occasional agreements. Whether you agree or disagree, every answer will teach you something, and we hope you'll come away with a new sense of Jewish variation and Jewish wisdom. So I'll leave it to that and then see if people have questions, since questions are sort of the name of the game here.
Wow, toda rabah. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was very, very impressive. Now, friends, let me just remind you that you can use the chat function to post a question. But we have one question that came in right away, and let's start with this question for our guest lecturer. How do you, at moment, choose the rabbis to participate in the Ask the Rabbi column?
I noticed when you ask, should we edit our children's genes, you would expect some rabbis to say, ooh, that's a great idea, and others to say, ooh, that's scary, eugenics, that's bad, it takes away our humanity, playing God, and so forth. So it turned out that for the most part, people who, some of the rabbis who were just sort of ordinary, looking at this from an ordinary ethical perspective, some of them said, ooh, I'd worry about eugenics, but on the other hand, some aspects of this are a very good idea. Think of all the good you could do. So you had a range of those. But then the rabbis who knew what they were talking about on this, invariably, like 3 of them from different, Orthodox, a conservative, and a I forget, I think the humanist, all said, no way, way too soon. We have no idea what we're doing. It's not even time to ask about the ethical questions yet. We're just not there. So I thought that was actually very educational. Like, in the abstract, all sorts of things might seem okay, but if you actually know what you're talking about, some things that might seem okay are actually not all that okay. We had a question a couple of years ago. This one's not in the book. We had a question about how would you counsel a sexual predator? And for that, we reached out to rabbis who actually had some experience in this, partly because that was the one question almost every rabbi, you very rarely get a question where every rabbi says, I'm not qualified to answer this question. But that was one where a lot of people really didn't feel they could answer unless they'd actually done that kind of work. We asked a question about the question for transgender, for instance. We wanted to make sure we had at least one actual transgender rabbi, and yes, there is one. There is one ordained transgender rabbi in North America that I'm aware of, and he is in the book. So,
well, that's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you for that. A couple of more questions have come in since then, and I'd like to ask you, if it's not divulging proprietary information, if you could speak to the in-house Moment magazine dialectic. How does Moment magazine come up with the questions that will be asked?
So pretty much the way we come up with any story idea, which is to say in the weekly editorial meeting, we start off, we try to think what's in the air, what's going to be in the air. 2 months from now when the magazine is printed, there are winter questions and there are summer questions. There are holiday questions, but there are a couple of questions we're always trying to get to. We want to avoid questions that are simple matters of fact where everyone will say the same thing. We want to avoid questions that will produce, there's questions that are very narrow that will just produce simple answers where the rabbit, well, this is the answer to that question. Like if you say, do Jews believe X? Like we had a long discussion a couple of years ago over what to ask. We wanted to ask a Passover question, but there just didn't seem, I mean, since Passover is sort of made of questions, it was very difficult to come up with something fresh. We wanted something that bothered people, but not so much that they would reject the question. And after a lot of back and forth and round, we came up with a question which actually came out very well. It's not in the book. Should Jews at the Seder pray to God to smite their enemies? It turns out that a lot of people have thought a lot about this. And we knew that some people would say it was fine and some people would say it was horrendous, but that they would all have interesting reasons. So that took us a good 45 minutes to come up with that question because we just kept proposing things and then shooting them down. Typically, somebody will propose a question and then someone else will like, that these are guys are going to just say this and these guys are going to say this. So, and we know our, the longer you've been working with the rabbis, the longer you have a sense like, that's no good. These guys will just say this and these guys will just say this. So you want something that will keep them thinking. And I will say, I was very proud of myself. There was a couple of years ago, there was a little wavelet where all these different publications were doing Ask the Rabbis. All of a sudden, everyone was asking the rabbis this and that. And we thought, oh, they're going to mess with our franchise. I mean, not that it's such an original idea, but not that many people ask it exactly the way we ask it. And a couple of them had come around to some of my regulars, and I was talking to one of my regulars, and he said, yeah, they asked me some questions, but you guys ask good questions. So, and we try, we really do.
That's a very nice endorsement. On the subject of the Passover Haggadah, I still remember when the Rabbinical Assembly came out with its Feast of Freedom, which is still its current edition, but the experimental edition came out right around 1980 or 1981. And I remember noticing at the time that it didn't say Egypt, it said Mitzrayim. And of course, you could understand that as saying, well, Mitzrayim is a spiritual condition. It's not only a geographical location, but I was left with the strong sense that we've just had the Camp David Accords. Israel and Egypt have made peace. And now we're going to sit at the Passover table. It's quite all right to nurse a grudge at Mitzrayim, but we don't want to tell people to dislike the Egypt of 1980. After all, they just made peace with us. Who knows?
That's funny. I like that.
Now, on the subject of the rabbis to whom you reach out, have you had the opportunity to ask any of the women graduates of Yeshivat Maharat?
It's an interesting question. I don't think we have had any of them in the feature. I know a couple of the local Maharayot graduates personally, because I run this other thing under my other hat with the Jewish Study Center, and we've worked with a lot of programming that a Maharat has done on various occasions. But now that you mention it, I do not think we have done that. We have. There's another part of the magazine called Symposium, which has much wider ranging questions, and we asked a question of a bunch of people. The question was, is Judaism good for women? And actually, that question is also we did ask the rabbis, is Judaism good for women? And that's in the book. That would have been a good question for a Maharat, but I do not think we asked them that. It's good. So it's a good point. That's something to keep in mind. We did have at least when Maharat was answered the question, but not in this feature.
Well, just a little bit tongue in cheek. I do a lot of ecumenical work, and I can tell you that after any given Sunday, when I give a lecture or a sermon at a place like Christ in St. Luke's downtown, I have people who come up to me and they definitely think that Judaism would be good for Gentiles.
Right. Is Judaism good for women? It's good for everybody, right? That's
Now,
funny.
I'd like to ask you a question going back to uh, the the run of years now, which is really approaching a respectable run of years. We mentioned earlier how much polarization there is in society today, and you made the point that we see in the rabbinic answers some resistance to that, which is kind of inspiring. But do you also see as a general pattern that the polarization of American life is also reflected in the answers, or not at all?
It's really a good question. I mean, not so far, not specifically with these rabbis, but I think that's because we know them.
Hmm.
I do think it's become more difficult to get rabbis to the right of Chabad to take part in this feature. It's before my time. We had a variety of people who, as I mentioned before, who were identified as ultra orthodox, and we have a few of them in the book, but mostly they're from those early days. And I remember having an interaction with a rabbi I reached, who was a gentleman named Abraham Tversky, and he's very, very eminent and well known. I think he was about 95 at the time, and was not only a rabbi but also had written a great flotilla of health and sort of self-help books, using the Hasidic perspective. And we were trying. He didn't want to be called ultra orthodox,
Hmm.
and so I said, "Well, what can we call you?" And he said, "Well, I'm Hasidic." And we also had a Chabad, so I said, "Well, Chabad is also Hasidic. Are you any particular kind of Hasidic?" And I said, "What's your sort of flavor of Hasidism?" He said, "I'm a Tversky Hasid," and which was his name. And he said, "That's my family, are Tversky Hasidim. That's our sect. We've always been the leaders of this sect, and that's who we are. And I can't think of anything else for you to call me." And so, I ended up, we couldn't come up with an answer to this. And the top of the editor said, "Oh, come on, we've always said ultra orthodox. Let's just call him ultra orthodox." And so we called him ultra orthodox. After that, he never took my calls, and I can't say I really blame him. But so I felt bad about it. So those are little things. Um, I do think that we're missing out on a lot of people who probably don't even consider us Jews anymore. This range, even though we're all looking at the same texts, even though we have some very orthodox rabbis, and I have an ongoing dialogue with one of the more traditionalist Orthodox rabbis who's a regular. And I not only does he write for this, but we talk to him all the time. He's given us lots of story ideas, and you see it more in politics. Like, I also edit the columns, the opinion columns, and it's much more difficult to have. For instance, you can't, like, we are actually politically nonpartisan. We have a sensibility. People probably would identify our sensibility as somewhat left leaning, but we always use a liberal and a conservative Israeli columnist and a liberal and a conservative American columnist. That's our general format. And we gave up on having Israeli columnists write about America. We just couldn't do it. Like, they had no idea what was going on in America, particularly the right wingers, but not only. And so I think that's like a sign of sort of slippage of not so much of the community where they are, but just of whether they can talk to each other. So,
Right.
but again, I think that's more politics. I think if you actually got a liberal and a conservative rabbi sitting down talking about halacha or studying Talmud together, as long as one of them wasn't female, you could probably do just fine.
Hmm.
You know?
Well, it's amazing what actual contact will do to humanize the other. That's certainly true. Well, we're beginning to run to the end of our hour, but I have time for one more question, and one more question came in. So I'd like to ask it on behalf of those who raised the question, and I'm sure others are thinking of it. Um, can you recall any particular subject that in your editorial meetings you decided was just so controversial that you didn't want to ask it?
I've been asked that question before, and honestly, I can't. I mean, it's been observed a couple of, I noticed myself sort of after I finished with this manuscript, it dawned on me that there weren't any questions in the book about Israel. And I was sort of startled to see that. And it's really not because of sensitivity. It's just because when you ask a question about Israel, it tends to get out of date because it's usually pegged to the news. So we haven't had any really, really timeless evergreen questions on Israel. But, you no, I mean, we want them to think. We want them to kind of wake up and even get angry, and we're happy to do that. I mean, we're not going to be offensive, but I can't think of a way you'd be offensive. Just off the top of my head, I can't think of it. I mean, Moment's definitely in the business of um, making people think and challenging people to think. So yeah, no, I wouldn't.
Right.
Really, nothing comes to mind.
Well, I don't imagine that you sell a lot of porridge if you sell cold porridge. It's
Oh, you mean it's got to be hot?
if it's a little bit too hot, it can still cool off, but if it's too cold to begin with, it's never going to sell.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we don't agreement. Agreement is not what we want. Although, as I said in the body of the talk about the answers about addiction, my favorite kind of disagreement is where under it there's sort of this underlying agreement that is just being described in different vocabularies, and that's I really have faith that there is such a thing. So
Well, Amy, let me voice on behalf of the community that has gathered tonight. We have a very impressive and diverse community here. And also on my own behalf, a very hearty thank you, Toda Rabbah, both for your lecture tonight and more broadly for the work that you are doing. Because I feel more than ever that it is a machloket l'shem shamayim, and that we Jews can only benefit when we go through this process. So again, yishar kochech and toda rabah. Also to our audience, thank you for joining us tonight. This is part of the process of Talmud Torah. You're never too young and you're never too old for Talmud Torah, and it's good that you're continuing in it. There are many fine programs in store for you at the Simon Family Jewish Community Center and at the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater. Let me share just a couple of upcoming events with you. I feel odd. Normally, I turn to a synagogue president and said, please give your attention to so-and-so for upcoming events, but here I am doing it as a rabbi. I think my tongue will cleave to the roof of my mouth or something. So please join this weekend to cook along with award-winning chef Michael Solomonov as he prepares a Hanukkah feast. And also in January, if you can see my screen, I'm going to hold up a card which came just today in the mail today, and this advertises our Melton program, which is going to be beginning again. We have a number of courses that you can register for online. One course is called Social Justice, the Heart of Judaism in Theory and Practice. Another course is From Sinai to Seinfeld, Jews and Their Jokes. And both of those are 10-week courses on Thursday mornings from January 7th through March 11th. And then we can also give you the option of a shorter commitment, a 6-week course, beginning on April 22nd, and two choices. OMG, can you believe? On questions of what do Jews believe? And then another one, Soul's Cycles, a ride through the chapters of life. So for those of you who are Melton veterans, I see in our group tonight both those who administered the program, salutes to you, and those who taught in the program in its previous iterations, and a number of students who were veterans. So there's a lot of new material that you would still find interesting. And if you've never taken a Melton course, then it's one of the best adult Jewish education programs you can imagine. So once again, there's lots doing. COVID has forced many of us into a kind of quarantine, but electronics have allowed us to find ways to reconnect. And this is all part of that. Please go to jewishva.org. That's Jewish, capital V, capital A.org for more information and to register. And finally, be safe, be well, be healthy, and since Hanukkah is not far away, a wonderful, wonderful festival of lights to all.